So I saw lots and lots of first assignments came in just fine. No one seemed to have too much trouble, but that's good. If you have any questions, feel free to raise them. The next assignment is a little more complicated in terms of the deliverable, in that you have to turn in your game folder. You have to turn in I think we're going to make a terrain, which I'm going to talk about today. And so Brightspace is really unable to handle the giant files that we tend to produce with Unity. So the solution to this is to use our Google Drives. We all have Google Drives on the main.edu accounts, and I can download things from the Google Drive. So what you turn in on the Brightspace is a shareable link to your Google Drive where you have deposited a zipped up game folder. It has to be all one file. Otherwise, Google flogs. If you put just your game folder over there, Google wants to zip it up, which takes forever. So you zip it up or compress it, whatever utility you want to use. There are many compressors that will turn things into a single compressed file. Put that on your Google Drive and deposit a shareable link to that single file on the Brightspace. I'm then able to access that and download it, and everything goes smoothly. But the Brightspace can't handle the big files that we generate. So anyone have any questions about that particular procedure? And you have to be sure that it's a shareable link. If you just give me a link, then it doesn't work. But when you click on it to share it in your Google Drive, make sure it's a shareable link. We'll wrestle with that as we go on. So I'll share a screen here now. Let me clean this up a bit. Clean this up a bit. Oops. The question for you guys on my screen, the little window in the top right-hand corner here shows Tim Heaton. It doesn't show me. What do you guys see? Somebody say what you can see.
We see you, but only if you're talking.
Okay. It doesn't seem to respond on my machine. Now I see Adam Levinson, who's up there, but it doesn't matter. I don't need to see myself. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the terrain editor, which is a tool in Unity for building two-dimensional terrains on which our characters can walk around. And before I do that, I want to bring in some assets. In particular, I want to bring in the characters, the standard asset characters. And you can get these either by downloading Unity 2.17 and getting a copy of it. You can download the standard assets from the asset store, but that makes a whole ton of stuff. Oh, and I believe it's on my Google Drive under standard assets 2.17. So you can also get them from there. I've kind of separated them. Where are they? They're right here. So I'm going to bring in just the character component. This is the advantage of bringing it in from Unity 2.17, is that you don't have to load all the standard assets. You can just load the components you're interested in. And in this case, I want the characters. So I'll open that. And this shows me all the stuff that's going to come in. I'm only going to bring in the first person character. I'm not going to bring in the rollerball or the third person character because they're kind of expensive in terms of storage, but I'll import that and a bunch of stuff will compile and come in. And now I have a standard assets folder that has characters, first person controllers, and under prefabs, they're the controllers. Now, because this is Unity 2.17, in the console here, I'm seeing some errors. And if I leave these alone, I can't play a scene. It'll tell me something like all compiler errors have to be fixed. And this is old stuff from Unity 2.17. And if you click on one of these, it shows you the file, the offending file, and you can just delete these and the errors go away. These are utility scripts that we don't use very much. And so we can just delete them rather than going in and fixing the errors in them. And there are also a lot of warnings, but don't worry about them. A lot of warnings, but don't worry about that. Now, the other thing I want to bring in from the standard assets are the environment package. And the environment package has a bunch of stuff that is really useful for building our terrains. It brings in a bunch of trees. It brings in, there are 3 trees. It brings in some billboard textures for grasses and some surface textures for texturing the terrain, and a bunch of different kinds of water. And so I'll import that and bring that in. And it takes some time the first time to bring in these assets. And again, here's that forest reset and that activate menu. These are brought in every time you import anything. Okay. Now, if you want to, there are also some nice packages, which I believe I've put on the, which I believe I've put on my Google Drive. Where are we? Sorry about this, wandering around. Resources. I believe I've put these on my Google Drive. There's a ground texture pack and there's the terrain demo assets. Those have more textures, but they're kind of big, and if you're not going to use them, it's not worth bringing them in. I'm going to leave them alone for now and just use the standard assets. So I brought in the character because, of course, we're going to walk around on our terrain. We want to see what it looks like at ground level to a character who's walking around. So I'm going to build a terrain here, and I do this with game object, 3D object, 3D object, and then terrain. And so this brings in my terrain, and it's a rectangle, and there's my terrain. And I will note that this is the other thing that's been created that goes with this terrain, this new terrain. So there are a couple of different buttons that we want to deal with here. Oh, and one other thing, when working with terrain, because we're going to be pushing the relief up and down, we're going to be sculpting the shape of this thing, it's a good idea to set your light to have kind of a low angle, maybe 15. So now my light is coming in at an oblique angle. It's going to make better shadows on the surface of the terrain so that I can more clearly see the bumps that I'm going to be building as I sculpt this terrain. The other thing that's important is to open the lighting window. It's a pull down from here. I forget where it is, lighting settings. And in particular, turn off auto generate. The other thing to turn off is mixed lighting. And that's because these are fairly expensive operations that go on in the background, and they're going to flog your computer as you build these big scenes. We'll talk later about doing things with these lighting tools, but for now you want to turn this off. You want to make sure auto generate is off, and you want to press the generate lighting, and this will then generate lighting for this particular scene. You notice my terrain changed from an unlit kind of brown color to this white color that I have here. And if you don't do this, if auto generates on, every time you change something in your scene, it will go out and attempt to recreate the lighting for your scene. And this is going to show down here in this little bottom here. I'll turn on auto generate here and mixed illumination. And you can see this thing is now starting to bake this. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of cycles off your computer. So as we're building this, be sure and turn off the bake global illumination and the real time if it happens to be on, and also turn off the auto generate and generate it manually with one button press. The other thing, I don't know why it's preparing a bake. The other thing you'll notice here in the scenes is that this is added another folder here. The sample scene, this is where all of that lighting data ends up, is in this extra little folder here. So it has the same name as our scene, and it contains the lighting data. And I'm going to cancel that and do it one more time. Shouldn't take so long. All right, so looking at the terrain here, this is the terrain component that we use to build our terrain. We have a collider on the terrain, a special kind of terrain collider. We'll talk about colliders later. And there the bake is done. Now there are a couple of different buttons here. One is a tiling that we can make copies of our terrain surrounding it. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to Apple Z undo it. And the main button we're going to use is this one. This is the paint tool where we raise, lower terrain, paint texture, set height, and do other stuff. Now, before I do that, I want to go into the terrain settings. And the thing I want to do here is make the terrain smaller, because right now it's 1,000 by 1,000. It's a big terrain, and its height goes to 600, which is a lot for 1,000 by 1,000 terrain. So I'm going to set this down to 200. So it's now 200 meters. And I'll set the height to 60 meters. And so my terrain is now a much more manageable piece. Generating lighting will take less time because it has less stuff that it has to compute. And so it's a good idea to make your terrain a manageable size. You can make it big, but it costs more with a bigger terrain. Okay, so right away, this first, the paint tool lets us do a whole bunch of stuff. And the first thing I want to do is set the height. And I'm going to set the height to 10. And I'm going to flatten the whole thing. So the whole terrain, you notice, moved up. It's all now at 10. And the reason I do this is because later I'm going to make depressions in the terrain that will be my lakes or oceans or whatever it is. And so setting the whole height to 10 means now that as I make mountains, they'll rise up out of 10. And as I make lakes, they'll press down into lower surfaces. Now, the important tool here is the raise and lower terrain tool. And we do this with different brushes. These brushes make different textures. We've got kind of a all white and all black. White is where it paints, black is where it doesn't. So this is going to paint a circle on my terrain. And then we have these fuzzier ones that grade out into darkness. And we have some kind of fuzzy ones here that make kind of bumpy terrain. We have two settings for the brush. One, its size. So if I make this 20, my brush here is now 20 out of the 200. Let me make it bigger than that. Let me make it 50. So here's my brush, and you get kind of a picture of what the brush looks like as well. The other setting is the opacity. And this is how strongly it will affect the terrain. If this number is small, say 5, the effect of this brush is relatively subtle. You can see I'm building terrain there. I'm getting bumps. And this is why I set the light down to a low angle so that I would see the shadows. If I set this back up to 20, now a stronger brush, this is going to have a stronger effect, and it's going to paint terrain more strongly. And so as I do this, this terrain is rising up out of the uniform 10 that I made that terrain. And the longer I do this, the higher it's going to get. If I kind of sit here for a while, and by the way, I'm pressing the left mouse button as I do this. And so that's built a kind of terrain. So let's go into the standard assets here, first person character, and drop a character into our scene here. And so I've dropped a character into the scene, and I'm going to turn off this other camera because otherwise I'm going to get a message that there are 2 audio listeners in the scene. Each of these cameras has one. So I'll just turn that camera off. We might come back and use it for something else later. So I've made some bumps in my terrain. I've got a character in here. I can walk around on this terrain that I've built, and it's got all these proper bumps in it, and it's actually beginning to look a little bit like a world in which we could make our game. So I made the object with Game Object 3D, select terrain. I went into the gear settings and changed the resolution. It says here 550. And that first button creates those neighbor terrains. We're not going to deal with them. I set the height and flattened it all and set it to 10. It says 20 in the notes, but it's different. And so I've got my terrain is 200 by 200, and it goes to a maximum height of 60. And having set it to 10 lets us push the terrain down to make lakes or rivers or whatever. So let me do that. So I'm going to select this brush now, and I'm going to put a lake here in the center. And to push the terrain down, I do the shift and left click. And so that pushed the terrain down, and it'll push it down as far as the 0. And so if I push this far enough, we'll end up with a flat bottom with our for our lake that we've built here in the terrain. You can see the flat bottom down there at 0. So we can raise and lower terrain, and we can do the same thing with the other brush here with activate this. I can do that with this other brush that had the kind of bumps on it. Whoops, with the bumps on it, this one. Or was it this one? This one. So I can also shift and lower it with this. So you can make bumps that go up, and you can make bumps that go down with this painting tool with the different brushes. And here's a strange one that will make a little fort over here, a little pentangled fort. So that's raising and lowering terrain. And you can get very creative with this and make very fancy terrain. And I'll show you some more advanced tools later. Now, the next thing I want to do with the paint tool is paint tech. Well, let me show you the smooth height a bit here and do this kind of brush. As you generate terrain, you may want to smooth it out a bit. And so like this over here has kind of rough edges because it was a very black and white terrain. And so for this, I might smooth this a little bit to get rid of those sharp, rough edges. And so there's this smoothing tool that lets you smooth out those sharp edges that you might produce. And you can smooth any kind of terrain that you want, including the edges of the flat area there in our little lake. Now, the other tool that's cool is the paint texture tool. And this works the same way, except we're going to be painting texture. We're going to be painting textures on our world. Now, the first thing I have to do is add a terrain layer. And so I can create a layer here, and it's going to open a little select tool. And I'm going to look for a sand texture. I know that I have a sand texture here. I select that. And now my entire world, when I add that first texture, my entire world becomes that sand texture. And I'm now walking around on a world that is all of this sand texture. The layers. Now, we don't want a world that's all just one texture. So I'm going to add another texture. I'll create another layer here. And I think I have a cliff texture, cliff albedo. And so now I've got this texture. And these layers have a diffuse texture. They have a normal map, which is for bumps. And they have a mask map, which is for covering up different things, as well as some settings for how metallic, how smooth it is, and some other stuff. And we'll talk about this when we get to materials. These are kind of standard settings for materials. So selecting that new one and going down to the brush here and selecting one of these brushes, I can now, and let me turn the opacity down a little bit. This opacity now with painting textures is going to blend it with the texture that's behind it. So if I want my texture to be very strong and sharp, I'll use a fairly high opacity. But if I want it to blend kind of smoothly, I'll use something fairly low. So let's say 10 here, and let's make the brush a lot smaller at this point. And I'm now going to paint texture here on my world. So I'm painting this cliff texture on here, and the longer I hold it, the stronger it gets. So even at that 10, I've kind of made a texture that is pretty strong. Let me set this down to 2 and paint around my character here. Where are we? Well, we'll see it when we go in the world. So I've painted another texture on here, the rocky cliff here texture, and it blends kind of smoothly out into the sand texture. It doesn't have sharp edges because it's blending with the texture that's behind it. And the longer you hold it, the stronger it gets. And you can add a whole bunch of different textures here. If we look in our environment under terrain assets, we have billboard textures, and these are not textures that you want to use. These I'll show you are for painting grasses. Our surface textures are special textures that have been very carefully designed so that the right edge exactly matches the left edge and the top edge exactly matches the bottom edge, so that as they're tiled out onto the world, we don't see obvious edges between them. You can't just use any texture to paint on the world because it tiles them. You can see the tiling here, the repeat of these textures. It's kind of obvious from a distance, and that's one of the things that you can do with the settings here. You can change the tiling. This is a 2x2 tiling. If I change that, it'll change the size of those tiles on our terrain. And this is fiddling that you do. Let me add another terrain layer here. I'll create a layer, and this time I want to look for the mud. And you can also drop them directly in there, but here's the mud rocky albedo. And this is an example of a material that they've given us the normals for it. Here's what a normal map looks like. It's this kind of strange looking purple and blue texture that is used to make bumps on a regular texture. And when we get to materials, I'll show you how to make these and how to use these. But for now, on this texture, because we have a normal map for it, I can drop that in here. And now this texture is going to, wait, I did it on the wrong one. I think I did it on that one. Well, it's all right. You can see that that made kind of bumps in there. Let me get rid of that. I'll select way up at the top, none. And for this texture, I'll put the normal in. Okay. So now let's paint a little bit of this on the terrain. And I'll use this one and I'll paint it here. And so I've painted that around my little character here. And you can see that I've got a very nice textured terrain that has kind of lighting bumps on it. You can see the shadows, and this will respond to changing light. If I move the sunlight, the shadows in these bumps would change. So this is a very nice three-dimensional texture. So all very cool. Let me stop sharing here for a second and see if we have any questions so far. Anybody have any questions?
I put one in chat. It was basically that.
I'm
Can
sorry,
you
I don't
have-
see chat. So
That's all.
can you have it randomized between a few different textures which all tile together? Not automatically. I will show you a tool later that does procedural texturing that will automatically kind of blend textures together. But you can't really select a bunch of textures and put them down all at the same time. You have to do it manually. I'm sorry, I can't see chat when I'm sharing screen. It takes up too much space. Okay, so texturing with the paint tool is all very, very cool. Now, the next button here is the trees button, activate, the trees button. And this is done the same way with a paintbrush, just like that. And just like the textures, we have to add a tree. And the standard assets here come with 3 trees, the broadleaf, the conifer, and the palm. And I'm going to bring in the broadleaf tree and drop it here and add it. And so now I have a tree that I can paint on the landscape. So I can paint this on the landscape. Whoops. There's a case where the tree density, which is kind of like the opacity in painting texture, was way too high. It painted way too many trees. I can undo that by Apple Z-ing it, or I can erase them by shift clicking and erase all those trees. So if I set the tree density down here, way down to say 10, now if I paint trees, I get more reasonable spacing of trees, more reasonable trees. Now the other button that's kind of nice is the mass place tree. And if it has keep existing trees, which means that these 3 that I've got here would be retained, or with this, it'll just delete all the trees and place 100 or 10,000 on the landscape, which is way too many for our small little world. So here, if I place, say, 50 trees, and I don't want to keep existing trees, this will now place 50 trees out in the landscape. Now, there are some other settings for the trees that are kind of convenient. One is the tree height. Right now, it's in this little range here from kind of 0 to 1, but I'm going to pull the bottom of this down a bit so that the size range is now greater. So I'm going to get more variation in the size of my trees. And I'll do this again with a mass place of 50. And this time I won't keep the existing trees and I'll place them. And so now I've got a bunch of trees that vary in size. They're not all the same size. Some are big, some are little. And so I've got all these different trees. And these are the speed trees it's actually a commercial package. You can buy speed tree generator and you can make your own trees. And they're very, very cool. Some of the other packages, I didn't load it, but maybe I will now. Let's see, where are we? Terrain demo, ground to this one. The terrain demo assets. These are all on my Google Drive, by the way, for if you want to pick these up. I got them from the asset store. I didn't make them. So this one has a whole bunch of grasses. It has a lot of textures for painting terrain that don't come in the standard assets. And it has a whole bunch of older style trees. These older style trees, these are not speed trees. These are an older style of tree that actually have some advantages, particularly in terms of resources. So if I go here now to my terrain, I go here now to my terrain and pick trees. What's wrong? Oh, I got to get in a scene. I've crashed the scene. Uh-oh. Drat. Well, when I brought that in, it kind of crashed my terrain. So I know I got to start over here again with a terrain. Drat. Sorry about that. Set height 10, flatten, raise. Well, this is not going to be very pretty because I'm just, whoops. This is not going to be a very pretty terrain. Drat. The problem here was these terrains, the new terrain, the asset for the terrain that's in the project. When I brought in those terrain demo assets, there was already a terrain in there in the test scene. So let me look at that terrain. So this, when I brought that in, it clobbered the terrain that I already had there. I apologize for that. But what I want to do is paint. Well, I wanted to show you these other kinds of trees. And let me bring my character in here so I can walk around. And these other kinds of trees have they're three-dimensional objects when you're close to them, but as you get further away from them, they turn into billboards, which are less expensive to render. And this is a setting in the terrain tool, this is a setting here in the terrain tool, the billboards start and end. So when they turn into billboards is at 50 meters. So this can take some of the stress off of rendering all these different trees. Anything further than 50 away will be rendered as a billboard. A billboard is a two-dimensional texture that always is perpendicular to the camera. And so they're cheaper to render than three-dimensional things. But these things will turn into three-dimensional things when you get close enough to them. So they do appear three-dimensional when we're up close, but when we're far away from them, they turn into billboards, which is a handy tool. The speed trees don't do that. They're different. Now, the old-fashioned trees, the billboard kind of trees, and the newfangled ones, the speed trees. Now, the next tool is the detail tool. And here, because I brought this in, I have already loaded a whole bunch of detail textures. I have the ferns that I can, let me be very careful here. With details, you want to be sure the opacity is very, very low, because otherwise it's going to just completely flood the world. If this is even 0.1 and I texture this, that's the kind of thing that I get, is a mat of stuff. And this is expensive and will kill your frame rate. So Apple Z erases that. So an opacity of 0.001 for painting is, even that's a little bit strong. 0.0005, say. So now we're painting a little better. And I've got a whole bunch of details here that I can paint on my scene, different kinds of grasses that I can paint on the scene. And with details, you really don't see them unless you're up close. So this is something that you definitely don't want to paint from a distance, because you can't see what you're doing. You want to be down in fairly close to paint these details. Now, the other kind of detail is a detail mesh. And here, I think I have a detail mesh. We have a rock. So this is a detail mesh. And with this, we want the render mode to be vertex lit, and we want both the healthy color and the dry color to be white. And I'll add that detail mesh. And I also want this to be very, very low, 0.0001. And I'll paint, that was too low, 0.001. And I'll paint these detail meshes on. Whoops, I got to select the rock. And I'll paint these details on. They're made a lot of rocks. Now, this is made a lot of rocks. The problem with this tool is they don't have colliders. So you can't walk on these details. And so you go right through them. So it's less than useful, and I don't think anybody would actually use this tool. Can I undo that? Yeah, there we go. Those are gone. So details don't have colliders. That's kind of makes it less useful. So we've painted textures on the terrain. We've raised and lowered, we've smoothed the terrain, we've painted trees on the terrain, we've mass placed trees on the terrain, The standard assets have speed trees that are very detailed three-dimensional trees. And in this older asset pack, we had some of these old-fashioned billboard trees. They're very nice. And we had grass textures. And again, I want to emphasize that textures that we use for painting terrain are these special repeating textures whose left edge matches their right edge. And the grasses are special textures that have what's called alpha channels. And so they look like cutouts of the grass. Here's the red one that we've got showing in the view here. The alpha channel means that this part is all invisible and we only see the outlines of these little things here. And if I go in and I walk around in my world, which is now pretty heavily populated with stuff, you can see that these billboard textures always turn to face the camera. They're actually just little billboards. They wave in the wind. There's wind in Unity, and these things sway back and forth in the wind, which is all pretty cool. And I believe the trees also can sway in the wind, although these don't seem to be set up to do so. But that's all very cool. And so I'm almost out of time here. I've paid no attention to the slides here. So the different tools, we have the size of the brush and the opacity, how heavily it applies raising. Left mouse raises, shift, left mouse lowers. We painted terrain. I recommended turning the light down low. We can set the height, puts it to a particular level, and you can actually paint set height as well. If you set height to 20 and you paint it, it will move the height towards 20, both up and down. We smoothed height, we painted texture, we added layers. We were also careful with the opacity here, setting it low so it blends. And different brushes. We brought in a character so that we could play around on our world. We painted trees with the third tab. Some trees, the older ones have bend factors. The mimosa and banyan that I brought in there have bend factors. And we can paint trees on the terrain. Left clicking paints them, shift left clicking erases them. We had settings for brush size, tree density, width, height, and rotation. The detail tab for painting grasses. Again, making sure that these are the specific kinds of textures that have alpha channels for painting in them. And they display as billboards, 2D objects that face the viewer. I believe you have the option of turning that off so that they're fixed billboards, but they don't look as realistic. Adding grass, you want to be close up with a small brush to paint them, and a very low opacity. If you're not careful, you'll very quickly overwhelm the scene, and a lot of grass is very laggy. Zoom in and paint details at a very close range with a small brush. I showed you painting mesh objects, the rocks. They don't have colliders, so they're marginally useful. The textures, this is the kind you would use for details. It has an alpha channel. If you paint this on the terrain, it looks kind of weird. These are the ones that you paint on terrain. They're the special tile textures that repeat. The cogwheel general settings, I showed you the length, width, and height, but it also has a bunch of other settings that deal with the resolution of your terrain, how highly resolved it is, the tree distance, where you can, how many trees you can see, and other stuff. And I'll remind you that for any of these tools in Unity, if you click on the little question mark icon, it opens up your documentation for that particular tool. And that's very convenient. And I'll pick up here next time with skyboxes and some other tools. So I'll stop there. Stop sharing and entertain questions. Any questions? And I will leave the Zoom open here if you guys want to chat among yourselves as well. You don't have to talk. I hope, well, most of you are gone now, but I hope you remember to type your name in chat for the attendance record.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for coming.